The man who stopped the train had a name most folks had forgotten, and that's exactly how Ethan Cade preferred it. He swung onto the rear platform of the last passenger car with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than in chairs. The conductor, a thick-necked man named Dunphy, who'd been running the Northern Pacific Line for 15 years, met him with a shotgun and a scowl. "You got some nerve, mister," Dunphy said, barrel leveled at Ethan's chest. "Stopping a train in open country like that could have derailed us." Ethan pulled a folded paper from inside his duster and held it up between two fingers. "Territorial Marshal's authority. I need this train stopped at Redemption Station. Got business there." Dunphy squinted at the document, then at Ethan's face. The stranger wore dust like a second skin, his dark coat weathered to the color of old blood. His hat sat low, shadowing eyes that seemed to calculate the distance between a man's heart and a bullet with unsettling precision. "Redemption Station ain't even a proper stop," Dunphy muttered, lowering the shotgun. "Just a water tower and a loading platform." "I know." Ethan's voice carried no emotion, just fact. "You gonna tell me what kind of business?" "The kind that doesn't concern railroad men." The train lurched forward, and Ethan moved past the conductor into the passenger car. Families sat rigid in their seats, watching him with the wide-eyed wariness of rabbits spotting a wolf. A young boy pressed his face against his mother's shoulder, and she stroked his hair with trembling fingers. Ethan found an empty bench near the back and settled into it, hat pulled low, appearing to sleep. But his mind was already miles ahead, running through the information he'd gathered over the past 3 months. Rico Varela. The name tasted like copper and gunpowder in his mouth. The outlaw had cut a path of violence from Texas to Montana territory, leaving burned homesteads and unmarked graves in his wake. His gang operated with brutal efficiency, hitting banks, stagecoaches, mine payrolls. They favored small towns without telegraph lines, places where help couldn't arrive before they'd vanished into the mountains like smoke. The territorial government had placed a bounty of $5,000 on Varela's head. Dead or alive, though everyone knew alive was just a formality printed on paper. Men like Rico Varela didn't survive capture long enough to see a courtroom. Ethan had tracked him north through a dozen false trails and dead ends. But in a ramshackle saloon outside Helena, a drunk miner had mentioned seeing a group of heavily armed men ride toward the Bitterroot Mountains, led by a Mexican with a scar that split his face from temple to jaw. That was 2 days ago. Now the train carried Ethan toward Redemption Station, where his horse and supplies waited at a livery he'd arranged by wire. From there, it would be another day's hard ride into country so wild that even the crow avoided it. The locomotive's rhythm changed as they began to climb into higher elevations. Through the window, Montana territory spread out in endless folds of prairie grass and distant peaks still wearing their winter snow. The land held a savage beauty that Ethan had learned to appreciate without trusting. Pretty country could kill you just as dead as ugly. "You a lawman?" Ethan opened his eyes to find an old-timer standing in the aisle, weathered hands gripping the seatbacks for balance. The man had the look of a former prospector, bent spine, gnarled fingers, eyes that had seen too much disappointment. "Sometimes," Ethan said. "Sometimes." The old man chuckled without humor. "That's an honest answer, I suppose. You hunting someone?" "Could be." Rico Varela. The name hung in the air between them like gunsmoke. Ethan studied the old man more carefully, noting the way his right hand trembled, not from age, but from something deeper. "You know him?" Ethan asked quietly. The prospector's jaw worked, grinding teeth or memories. "My daughter did. She ran a boarding house in Silver Creek. Varela's gang came through last spring looking for a place to hole up. She took their money, gave them rooms, kept her mouth shut like any sensible person would." He paused, staring out the window at nothing. "When they left, they took everything. Money from her strongbox, food from the pantry, horses from the stable. And they took her." Ethan felt something cold settle in his gut. "How long did they keep her?" 3 days. Then they let her go, dropped her on the road 5 miles from town, wearing nothing but bruises and shame. The old man's voice cracked. "She hung herself that same night. Found her in the barn come morning." The train car had gone silent. Other passengers pretended not to listen while hanging on every word. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, and meant it. Sorry, don't bring her back. Sorry, don't make Varela pay. The old man leaned closer, his breath sour with whiskey. But a bullet might. You going after him for the bounty or for justice? Does it matter? To me it does. A man chasing money might let Varela live if the price is right. A man chasing justice won't stop until the devil himself is food for worms. Ethan held the prospector's gaze. I'm not in the habit of letting monsters go free. Something like satisfaction flickered across the old man's face. He reached into his coat and pulled out a tarnished silver crucifix on a chain. This was my daughter's. Only thing of hers I kept. If you find Varela, I want you to show him this before you kill him. Tell him Sarah Brennan says hello from hell. Ethan took the crucifix, feeling the weight of it. Not the silver, but the grief and rage it carried. He tucked it into his shirt pocket, next to the marshal's authority papers. I'll make sure he sees it, Ethan promised. The old man nodded once, then shuffled back to his seat, suddenly looking even older than before. The train rolled on through the afternoon, climbing higher into country, where pine forests crowded close to the tracks, and the air tasted of snow even in late spring. Ethan dozed in fits and starts, the kind of half-sleep that let him rest while staying alert to threats. They reached Redemption Station just before dusk. The station consisted of a water tower, a loading platform, and a small shed that might have once housed a station master but now stood empty, its door hanging crooked on leather hinges. Beyond the tracks, a rutted road led toward a distant cluster of buildings. Too small to be called a town, too organized to be just a camp. Ethan stepped off the train and immediately felt the change in the air. Up here, the wind carried different smells: sage and stone, pine sap and creek water. The kind of smells that reminded a man he was far from civilization's comforts. The train pulled away, leaving him alone on the platform as twilight settled over the mountains like a purple blanket. He walked toward the buildings, boots crunching on gravel, every sense alert. The settlement consisted of a general store, a blacksmith's forge, a livery stable, and what might generously be called a saloon, basically a large tent with wooden walls on three sides and a plank bar. A man emerged from the livery, wiping his hands on a greasy apron. He had the barrel chest and thick arms of someone who spent his days wrestling horses and lifting feed sacks. "You Cade?" the man called out. "I am." "Got your horse ready, and your supplies like you wired for." He jerked his thumb toward the stable. "That'll be $20, feed and boarding included." Ethan paid him, then followed him inside. The stable smelled of hay and horse sweat, good, honest smells. His mount stood in the third stall, a buckskin gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm temperament. Ethan had left the horse here a week ago specifically for this moment, rather than risk having it stolen or injured while he traveled by train. "Good-looking animal," the liveryman said. "Don't see many this well-trained. Where you headed?" "North?" "North," the man snorted. "That's Varela country up there. You know that?" "I've heard." "Hearing and knowing ain't the same thing, friend. That Mexican and his boys have been raiding all through these mountains. They hit a mining camp 2 weeks ago, killed 6 men, and made off with 40 pounds of gold. Sheriff rode up with a posse, but they never even found the camp. It's like those bastards just vanish into the rocks." Ethan began checking his saddle, making sure everything was secure. His Winchester rifle sat in its scabbard, cleaned and loaded. His saddlebags carried ammunition, dried meat, coffee, and a bedroll. Everything he needed to survive in country that didn't forgive mistakes. "I don't suppose you'd be interested in some advice?" the liveryman asked. "Go ahead." "Turn around. Get back on that train tomorrow and head somewhere civilized. Whatever you're chasing up there, it ain't worth your life." Ethan swung into the saddle, settling his weight, feeling the familiar connection between rider and horse. "I appreciate the concern. But you're going anyway." "I am." The liveryman shook his head. "Stubborn fool. Well, if you're determined to get yourself killed, at least do yourself a favor. There's a man in the saloon you should talk to first. Calls himself Colonel Hale. He's been asking questions about Varela, too." That got Ethan's attention. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest he's hunting the same prey. Difference is, Hale's been at it longer and knows these mountains better than most. You want to survive more than a day up there, you might want to pool your knowledge." Ethan considered that. He'd been working alone for 3 months, and it had yielded results, but slowly. Another experienced hunter might have information worth trading for. I'll talk to him, Ethan said. He left his horse in the stable and walked across the muddy street to the saloon tent. Inside, the space was dimly lit by kerosene lanterns, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. A handful of men sat at rough-hewn tables, drinking whiskey and speaking in low voices that stopped when Ethan entered. Behind the bar, a woman with iron-gray hair and a face that suggested she'd lived through harder times than these poured drinks with economical movements. She looked up as Ethan approached. "Whiskey," he said. She poured him 2 fingers in a glass that had seen better days. "You the one who stopped the train?" News traveled fast in small places. "That's right. Takes either courage or stupidity to pull a stunt like that. Which one are you?" "Still figuring that out myself," Ethan said, sipping the whiskey. It burned going down, which meant it was probably the good stuff by local standards. "You looking for Colonel Hale?" the woman asked. "How'd you know?" "Because you've got the look. Same look he had when he first rode in 3 weeks ago. Determined, dangerous, dead set on something stupid." She pointed toward a corner table. "That's him. Good luck." Ethan turned to look. The man sitting alone in the corner had the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in uniform, even though he wore civilian clothes now, dark trousers, a vest over a white shirt, a heavy coat draped across the empty chair beside him. He was older than Ethan, probably pushing 60, but he held himself like a man who could still handle trouble. Gray hair swept back from a broad forehead, and his face carried the kind of weathering that came from years in harsh climates. But it was his eyes that struck Ethan, pale blue, cold and calculating. The eyes of a man who'd killed before, and would kill again without losing sleep over it. Colonel Victor Hale sat with his back to the wall, a position that gave him a clear view of the entire room. His right hand rested near a Colt revolver that hung in a well-worn holster. He watched Ethan approach with the steady gaze of a predator assessing another predator. "You Cade?" Hale asked before Ethan could introduce himself. "I am." "Figured as much. Only one train came through today, and you're the only stranger who looks like he's got business with death." Hale gestured to the empty chair. "Sit. We should talk." Ethan pulled out the chair and sat down, keeping his own hand near his weapon. The 2 men studied each other across the scarred wooden table, each measuring the other's capabilities. "I hear you're hunting Rico Varela," Ethan said. "I am, and so are you, unless I miss my guess." Hale leaned back in his chair. "The question is why? You don't have the look of a lawman despite whatever papers you're carrying. You're too young to have a personal grudge that goes back years. So that leaves the bounty. You're a professional hunter. And you're not?" "Oh, I am, but I've got other motivations too." Hale's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those cold eyes, something darker than simple greed. "I've been tracking Varela for 8 months. Followed him from New Mexico territory all the way up here. Got close twice, but the bastard's slippery. His gang's loyal, well-armed, and knows this country better than most." "How many men does he have?" "Changes. I've counted anywhere from 15 to 25, depending on whether he's recruiting or if some have gotten themselves killed. They operate in smaller groups sometimes, then come together for big jobs." Hale paused to sip his whiskey. "They're planning something now. Something bigger than usual." "What makes you say that?" "Because they've been too quiet for the past 2 weeks. No raids, no robberies, no sightings. Men like Varela don't just sit idle. They're either planning or preparing." Hale set his glass down with deliberate care. "There's a bank in Copperfield, a mining town about 40 miles north of here. It holds payroll for 3 different mining operations. Every month, they bring in $20,000 in gold and currency. That's enough to tempt any outlaw, but it's also heavily guarded. 4 armed men inside, another 6 that the mining companies hire during payroll week." "You think Varela's going to hit it?" "I know he is. I've got a source. One of the barmaids at a roadhouse where his men drink. She overheard them talking about Copperfield and the big payday. Problem is, I don't know when, and I can't watch every approach to that town by myself." Ethan considered this. The information was valuable, but it came with obvious strings attached. "You're proposing we work together." "I'm proposing we don't get in each other's way and end up dead because of it." Hale's voice carried no warmth, just pragmatism. You want the bounty, I want Varela. We can both get what we want if we're smart about it. What's your stake in this? You said you've got other motivations. Hale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For a long moment, he didn't answer, and Ethan thought he might refuse. Then the older man reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small object, setting it on the table between them. It was a gold pocket watch, tarnished and dented, with an inscription on the back that Ethan couldn't read from his position. My wife gave me this on our wedding day, Hale said quietly. Took her 6 months of saving to afford it. She was a school teacher in Santa Fe, practical, intelligent, kind. We had 15 good years together, built a life, raised a daughter, thought we'd grow old watching grandchildren play in the yard. He picked up the watch, turning it over in his weathered hands. 7 years ago, I was away on territorial business. I actually was a colonel then, cavalry. A gang came through Santa Fe, robbing stores and terrorizing the residents. My wife heard the commotion and tried to get our daughter to safety. She was 12 years old, just starting to look like her mother. Ethan felt the temperature in the room drop. They shot my wife in the street. Took my daughter. When I got back 2 days later, I found my wife in the undertaker's parlor and my daughter in the creek behind town, face down in 3 feet of water. She'd been used, then drowned. The words came out flat, emotionless, but Ethan recognized that tone. He'd heard it before in other men who'd learned that showing emotion only gave pain more power. The gang was led by a young Mexican who'd just started making a name for himself, Hale continued. A man with a fresh scar on his face from a knife fight. A man named Rico Varela. Understanding settled over Ethan like a heavy coat. This wasn't about the bounty for Hale. This was about vengeance, pure and simple. The kind of vengeance that could make a man patient, methodical, willing to track his prey across territories in years. The army couldn't spare resources for a manhunt, Hale said. They had their hands full with Indian conflicts and border security. So I resigned my commission and went hunting on my own. That was 7 years ago. I've gotten close before, but Varela's always managed to slip away. Sometimes I think he knows I'm after him specifically, likes the game of it. He might, Ethan said. Men like that enjoy thinking they're untouchable. But they're not. Hale put the watch back in his pocket. Every man can be killed. You just have to be willing to do whatever it takes. The saloon had grown quieter, though whether because of their conversation or the late hour, Ethan couldn't say. Outside, the wind had picked up, making the tent walls flutter and snap. So what's your plan? Ethan asked. I was going to ride to Copperfield tomorrow, scout the town, try to figure out when and how Varela plans to hit the bank. Then set up a position and wait for him to come to me. Hale studied Ethan. But now you're here, and that changes the possibilities. How so? Because Varela doesn't know you. He knows me, or at least knows someone's been tracking him. I've had to kill 3 of his men over the years when they spotted me getting too close. But you're fresh, unknown. If you play it right, you might be able to get closer to his operation than I ever could. Ethan understood where this was going. You want me to infiltrate his gang? It's risky, but it might be the only way to know for certain what they're planning. Varela's paranoid, but he's also always looking for skilled men. If you approach him right, make yourself useful without seeming too eager, he might bring you in on the job. And if he sees through it, then you're dead, and I'm back to doing this alone. Hale's expression was grim. I won't lie to you, Cade. This is dangerous as hell. Varela's killed men for less than looking at him wrong, but if you can pull it off, we'll know exactly when and where to hit him. We split the bounty 50-50, and I get what I really came for. Ethan turned this over in his mind. He'd done infiltration work before, back when he actually wore a badge instead of just carrying papers that said he could. It was delicate work. One wrong word, one inconsistent story, and you ended up in a shallow grave. But it also offered the best chance of ending this hunt quickly and decisively. I'll need details, Ethan said. Everything you know about Varela's operation, his habits, the men in his gang. I can't walk in blind. Fair enough. Hale pulled out a small leather notebook and pushed it across the table. I've been keeping notes, names, descriptions, patterns. Study it tonight. Tomorrow we ride north together until we get close to their territory, then we split up. I'll be your backup. Watching from a distance, ready to move if things go wrong. Ethan picked up the notebook, feeling the weight of shared commitment settling between them. This was no longer a solo hunt. Now he had a partner, which meant someone else to trust, someone else who could betray him. But it also meant backup in country where dying alone was easy and surviving alone was hard. "One more thing," Hale said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "When we find Varela, and we will find him, I need 5 minutes alone with him before he dies. That's my price for this partnership. 5 minutes to make him understand what he took from me." The request hung between them, dark and heavy with implications. Ethan knew what those 5 minutes would entail: pain, suffering, revenge, served cold and deliberate. It wasn't justice in any legal sense. It was something older, something more primal. "If we take him alive," Ethan said carefully, "those 5 minutes might alert every lawman and bounty hunter in the territory to where we are. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I need this, Cade. I need him to know why he's dying and who's killing him. Without that, the last 7 years mean nothing." Ethan studied the older man's face, seeing the grief and rage that lived there like permanent scars. He thought about Sarah Brennan, the boarding house owner who'd hung herself after 3 days in hell. He thought about all the other victims whose stories he didn't know, but whose ghosts probably haunted Varela's trail like a funeral procession. "All right," Ethan said, 5 minutes. But after that, we finish this clean and get out fast." Hale extended his hand across the table. "Deal." They shook, and in that moment, both men understood they'd just committed to a course that would end in either justice or death, and possibly both. The saloon keeper brought them another round of drinks, and they spent the next hour going through Hale's notebook, with the older man providing context and details for each entry. Varela's gang operated like a military unit, with clear hierarchies and specialized roles. There was Manuel Cortez, Varela's second-in-command, a former Mexican army deserter who handled logistics and planning. There was Jack "Blackjack" Morrison, an American who specialized in explosives and safes. There were the Santos brothers, twins who served as enforcers and muscle. And there was Varela himself, described as intelligent, ruthless, and surprisingly charismatic. Men followed him not just out of fear, but because he made them believe they were part of something greater than simple banditry. "He fancies himself a revolutionary," Hale explained. "Tells his men they're fighting against corrupt governments and greedy corporations that steal from the common people. Never mind that he keeps most of the money for himself and kills anyone who crosses him. He's built a mythology around himself, and his men buy into it." "How do I approach him?" Ethan asked. "Don't. Let him come to you. There's a trading post called Eagle's Rest about 15 miles north of here. It's neutral territory, a place where outlaws and legitimate folks both come to buy supplies and drink. Varela's men show up there sometimes, usually in small groups. If you hang around there, looking capable but not threatening, and if word spreads that you're skilled with a gun, they might approach you." "Might?" "It's the best option we've got. The alternative is trying to track them to their hideout, which is somewhere in the Bitterroot Mountains, in country so rough that even the natives avoid it. We could spend months searching and never find them." Ethan closed the notebook and handed it back. "I'll head to Eagle's Rest tomorrow. How will I contact you if I make progress?" "You won't. I'll be watching. If you get close to their operation, I'll know. If you need help, fire 3 shots in quick succession. I'll hear it and come running. Otherwise, we don't communicate until the job's done." They finished their drinks in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts about what the next days would bring. Finally, Hale stood and dropped some coins on the table. "Get some sleep, Cade. Tomorrow we ride into the devil's territory, and you'll need your wits sharp." Ethan watched him go, then sat alone for a while longer, listening to the wind rattle the tent walls and thinking about the path he'd chosen. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Rico Varela was planning his next move, unaware that 2 hunters were closing in, but hunters could become prey in the blink of an eye. Ethan finished his drink and headed out into the night to find a place to sleep, his hand never far from his gun, his mind already rehearsing the lies he'd need to tell to stay alive. The game had begun. Dawn broke cold over the Montana mountains, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold that would have been beautiful if Ethan had been the type to notice such things. He wasn't. He noticed instead the way frost clung to the grass, making it crunch underfoot, loud enough to give away a man's position. He noticed how the wind came from the north, carrying the scent of pine and snowmelt, which meant it would carry sound in the opposite direction. Details like that kept a man alive. He met Hale outside the livery just as the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline. The older man sat astride a dapple-gray mare that looked as weathered and capable as its rider. He'd tied his bedroll tight and his rifle hung within easy reach, positioned for a right-handed draw, professional, efficient. "Sleep well?" Hale asked. "Well enough." Ethan swung onto his buckskin, settling into the saddle. "You?" "I stopped sleeping well 7 years ago." Hale turned his horse north without waiting for a response. They rode in silence for the first hour, following a wagon trail that wound through stands of lodgepole pine and across meadows still wet with morning dew. The country rose steadily, each mile taking them higher into terrain that grew increasingly hostile to human habitation. This was land that belonged to elk and bear, to wolves and weather, to things that killed without malice simply because that was their nature. Around mid-morning, they stopped to water the horses at a creek that ran clear and cold over smooth stones. Ethan dismounted and knelt, cupping his hands to drink. The water tasted of minerals and distance, of mountains and sky. "We'll split up about 5 miles from here," Hale said, studying the trail ahead. "There's a fork in the road. Left branch goes to Eagle's Rest. Right branch leads higher into the mountains, towards some played-out mining claims. I'll take the right fork, circle around, and find a position where I can watch the trading post from a distance." "Muds, how will you know if I've made contact?" "I won't, not immediately, but if Varela's men take you somewhere, I'll follow at a distance. If they kill you—" Hale paused, something that might have been regret crossing his face. "Well, then I'll know this plan failed and I'm back to doing things the hard way." "Comforting," Ethan said dryly. "I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to kill Rico Varela." Hale's voice carried no apology. "You're a means to that end, useful, potentially valuable, but ultimately expendable if it comes to that." Ethan appreciated the honesty, even if he didn't like the sentiment. "Fair enough. Same goes for you from my perspective. I want that bounty, and I'll do what's necessary to collect it." They remounted and continued north, the trail growing rougher, more primitive. In places it disappeared entirely, and they had to navigate by landmark and instinct, following the path water would take, avoiding deadfalls and washouts, reading the country like text in a language most men never learned. The fork appeared just where Hale had said it would, marked by a lightning-struck pine that stood like a blackened finger pointing at the sky. They reined in their horses and sat for a moment, both men understanding this was the point where their fates diverged. "Remember," Hale said, "Varela respects strength and despises weakness. If you show fear or uncertainty, he'll see it. If you seem too eager to join, he'll suspect you. You need to be someone he wants, but doesn't need. Someone who can walk away but chooses to stay. I've played this game before. Not with these stakes." Hale's pale eyes fixed on him. "Men who fail at deceiving Varela don't just die. They die slowly, as examples to others. He once tied a suspected informant to a wagon wheel and left him in the desert sun with a leather gag soaked in kerosene. Took the man 3 days to die. The image hung between them, brutal and vivid. "I'll be careful," Ethan said. Hale nodded once, then turned his horse onto the right fork and disappeared into the trees without looking back. Ethan watched him go, then urged his buckskin onto the left trail, toward Eagle's Rest and whatever waited there. The trading post appeared in a clearing 2 hours later, and Ethan immediately understood why Outlaws favored it. The location offered clear sightlines in all directions, making ambush nearly impossible. The main building sat on a slight rise, constructed of rough-hewn logs with a sod roof and narrow windows that could serve as rifle ports if needed. Behind it stood a stable and several smaller outbuildings, probably storage sheds and living quarters. 3 horses stood tied to the hitching rail out front, and smoke rose from the stone chimney, suggesting active business despite the remote location. Ethan approached slowly, making no effort to conceal his arrival. Men emerged from the trading post to watch him ride in, 2 of them, both armed, both wearing the hard-eyed look of men accustomed to violence. They positioned themselves on either side of the door, hands near their weapons but not threatening. Yet. Ethan dismounted and tied his horse next to the others, moving with deliberate calm. He nodded to the two guards but didn't speak, then pushed through the door into the dim interior. The trading post smelled of tobacco smoke, leather, and coffee. Shelves lined the walls stocked with canned goods, ammunition, rope, tools, and other supplies necessary for survival in remote country. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat from the center of the room, and around it sat several rough tables and chairs. Behind a long counter stood a man who had to be the proprietor, tall and broad-shouldered, with a magnificent black beard streaked with gray and eyes that missed nothing. He looked up as Ethan entered, his expression neutral but assessing. "Help you?" the proprietor asked. "Coffee if you've got it. Supplies if the price is fair." "I've got both. Coffee's 2 bits a cup. Supplies depend on what you need." The man poured coffee from a pot on the stove into a tin cup and slid it across the counter. "Name's Garrett. I run this place." Ethan paid for the coffee and took a sip. It was strong enough to strip paint, which meant it was exactly what he needed. "Ethan Cade. Passing through." "Passing through to where? Ain't much north of here except mountains and misery." "Maybe I like mountains," Garrett chuckled, a sound like rocks tumbling in a barrel. "Maybe you do. Or maybe you're running from something, or running towards something. Either way, not my business, long as you pay your bills and don't cause trouble." "I don't cause trouble, I don't start." "Funny thing about trouble," Garrett said, wiping down the counter with a rag that had seen better days. "It's got a way of finding certain types of men, even when they're trying to avoid it." The door opened behind Ethan, and the two guards from outside entered, followed by a third man who carried himself differently. This one was older, maybe 40, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He wore his gun tied down low, gunfighter style, and his dark eyes swept the room before settling on Ethan with obvious interest. "Garrett," the man said, his accent carrying traces of Mexico. "Who's our new friend?" "Says his name's Cade. Says he's passing through." The man walked closer, studying Ethan with the intensity of someone evaluating livestock. "Passing through to where, Senor Cade?" "Wherever the trail leads," Ethan replied, meeting the man's gaze without challenge but without submission either. That's a careful answer, the kind of answer a man gives when he doesn't want to commit to details. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Manuel Cortez. These mountains are my workplace, you might say. I like to know who's traveling through them." Ethan recognized the name from Hale's notebook. Varela's second-in-command, the logistics man, the one who planned their operations. This was either incredibly fortunate or a test he hadn't seen coming. "Just a drifter looking for work," Ethan said. "Heard there might be opportunities up here for a man with certain skills." "What skills would those be?" "The kind that involve being comfortable with a gun and not asking too many questions." Cortez's smile widened slightly. "Interesting. Most men come up here looking for honest work, mining, trapping, that sort of thing. You're the first in a while to openly admit you're looking for dishonest work." "I didn't say dishonest. I said the kind that doesn't involve questions. There's a difference." "Is there?" Cortez pulled out a chair and sat down, gesturing for Ethan to do the same. "Tell me, Senor Cade, what brings a man like you to Montana territory? You've got the look of someone from further south. Texas, maybe? New Mexico?" "I've been a lot of places." Another careful answer. "You're very good at not saying much while appearing to answer questions." Cortez leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. "Let me be more direct. Are you running from the law?" The question hung in the air, dangerous as a loaded gun. Ethan knew his response would determine whether this conversation continued or ended with bullets. "I've had disagreements with the law," Ethan said carefully. "Nothing that involves murder or rape or crimes against women and children, but enough that I find it healthier to stay away from towns with telegraph lines and ambitious sheriffs." It was a calculated admission, enough truth to seem genuine, vague enough to avoid details that could be checked. Men like Cortez understood such distinctions. They lived in a world of gray morality where the law was often as corrupt as the outlaws it chased. Cortez studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "An honest answer, or at least an honest-sounding one. Tell me something else. How are you with that gun you're wearing?" "I hit what I aim at. Everyone says that. Few can prove it." Cortez stood and walked to the door, looking out at something in the yard. There's a bottle on that fence post out there. About 40 yards. Can you hit it? Ethan joined him at the door and looked. A whiskey bottle sat balanced on a weathered post, glinting in the afternoon sun. 40 yards was an easy shot with a rifle, trickier with a pistol. Cortez was testing him, seeing if his confidence matched his capability. Sure, Ethan said. He stepped outside into the yard, aware that everyone in the trading post had followed to watch. The two guards positioned themselves where they could respond if this turned ugly. Garrett stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Cortez stood beside Ethan, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. Ethan drew his Colt in one smooth motion and fired without seeming to aim. The bottle exploded in a shower of glass. Not bad, Cortez said, but that was a stationary target in good light. Real targets tend to shoot back. Then they usually miss. Ethan holstered his weapon. Because they're scared, and scared men can't shoot straight. And you don't get scared? Everyone gets scared. The difference is whether you let it control you or use it to stay sharp. Cortez nodded, something like approval in his eyes. You know, Senor Cade, I might have some work for a man with your particular skills and philosophical outlook. Pays well, but it's not for the weak-willed or loose-tongued. Interested? This was it, the moment Ethan had been working toward, but he knew better than to seem too eager. Men like Cortez valued things they had to work for, distrusted things that came too easily. Depends on the work and the pay, Ethan said. I'm not interested in petty robbery or anything that targets regular folks just trying to survive. But if you're talking about taking from people who won't miss it, banks, mining companies, railroad payrolls, that's different. A man with principles, Cortez laughed. I like that. Most of the trash that drifts through here would rob their own mothers for whiskey money. But you've got a code, even if it's not the law's code. We all draw our lines somewhere. True enough. Cortez pulled out a thin cigar and lit it, taking his time. Here's what I'm prepared to offer. There's a job coming up. I won't say more than that right now. It requires skilled men who can handle themselves in difficult situations. If you're interested in proving yourself, you'll ride with me now to meet my employer. He'll evaluate you personally. If he likes what he sees, you're in. If not, Cortez shrugged, then you ride away with your life and we forget this conversation happened. Who's your employer? You'll know when you meet him. That's part of the test, seeing if you can follow instructions without demanding information you haven't earned yet. Ethan pretended to consider this, letting silence stretch just long enough to suggest thoughtful deliberation rather than desperation. All right, but I keep my weapons. Of course. A man without his weapons is a sheep, and we're not looking for sheep. Cortez called to the two guards. Miguel, Tomas, get the horses ready. We're riding out. The guards moved quickly to comply, and Ethan felt the weight of the moment settling over him. He was about to ride directly into Varela's organization, surrounded by armed men who would kill him without hesitation if they suspected his true purpose. One wrong word, one inconsistent detail, and he'd end up decorating a canyon somewhere, food for crows and coyotes. But this was also exactly what needed to happen. You couldn't hunt a ghost by following its trail. You had to become part of the darkness it moved through, learn its patterns, find its weaknesses. 20 minutes later, they rode north into country that grew progressively wilder and more remote. Cortez led the way, followed by Ethan, with the two guards, Miguel and Tomas, bringing up the rear. They followed game trails and creek beds, routes that left minimal tracks, and would be nearly impossible to follow for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. As they climbed higher, Ethan memorized landmarks, a distinctive boulder shaped like a crouching bear, a lightning-scarred pine, a narrow gorge where water tumbled over smooth rocks. These were the breadcrumbs he might need to find his way out if things went wrong. You're quiet, Cortez observed after an hour of riding. Saving my breath for the climb. Smart. Most men feel the need to fill silence with words, as if talking proves they're not nervous. Cortez glanced back at him. But you're nervous, aren't you? Riding into the unknown with armed strangers, it would be unnatural not to be. I'm cautious, not nervous. There's a difference. Is there? Both involve fear of what might happen. Caution is fear tempered by preparation, Ethan said. Nervousness is fear without control. I know what I'm walking into, an evaluation by a man who doesn't trust easily. I know the risks. That's not nervousness, that's realism. Cortez laughed, genuinely amused. You have a way with words, Senor Cade. I begin to think you might fit in well with our organization. We appreciate men who can think as well as shoot. They continued climbing for another 2 hours, the terrain becoming increasingly rugged. At one point, they had to dismount and lead the horses single file along a narrow ledge with a sheer drop to one side. Ethan's buckskin handled it with steady nerves, which was good because one misstep meant a fall that would kill both horse and rider. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they emerged into a hidden valley that took Ethan's breath away despite his professional detachment. The valley stretched perhaps a mile across, surrounded on all sides by steep mountains that would make approach from any direction visible long before arrival. A stream ran through the center, feeding into a small lake that reflected the sky like polished silver. Scattered throughout the valley were several rough structures, cabins, a large barn, corrals for horses, and everywhere, armed men. Ethan counted at least 20 as they rode in, maybe more moving between buildings or standing guard at strategic points. This wasn't just a gang, this was a small army, well organized and well supplied. Hale had been right about Varela's operation being more sophisticated than typical outlaw bands. Welcome to Paradise Valley, Cortez said with evident pride, or as we prefer to call it, the place the law forgot. They rode toward the largest cabin, a structure built against the valley wall with a clear view of all approaches. As they dismounted, the door opened and a man stepped out, and Ethan knew immediately this was Rico Varela. He stood perhaps 5'10", compact and muscular, wearing dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. His hair fell to his shoulders, black as coal, and his face bore the scar Hale had described. A livid line running from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling his smile into something permanently sardonic. But it was his eyes that struck Ethan most forcefully. Dark, intelligent, and utterly without mercy. Manuel, Varela said, his voice carrying traces of education beneath the accent. You bring me a new prospect? I do, Jefe. This is Ethan Cade. Found him at Eagle's Rest asking about work. He's skilled with a gun and doesn't ask stupid questions. Varela descended the steps and walked slowly around Ethan, studying him from every angle like a horse trader evaluating livestock. Ethan stood still, neither defiant nor submissive, simply waiting. You have the look of a man who's killed before, Varela said finally. Not just in self-defense, but deliberately, professionally. I've done what needed doing. Another careful answer. My men seem to collect careful men lately. Varela stopped in front of him, close enough that Ethan could smell tobacco and whiskey on his breath. Tell me something not careful. Tell me something true. The demand hung between them, a test Ethan hadn't anticipated. He could feel the weight of watching eyes. Cortez, the guards, other men emerging from buildings to witness this evaluation. His answer would determine everything. I'm tired of being poor, Ethan said bluntly. Tired of taking scraps while the rich get richer off the backs of working men. Tired of watching corrupt lawmen and crooked businessmen act like they're better than everyone else because they rob people with contracts instead of guns. I'm good at what I do, and I want to get paid what I'm worth. You're offering that opportunity. That's the truth. Varela smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression Ethan had ever seen. Genuine amusement mixed with complete ruthlessness. Finally, Varela said, an honest answer. Or at least one that sounds honest, which is close enough for now. He turned to Cortez. What do you think, Manuel? Should we trust this careful, tired, skilled man? I think he shot that bottle at Eagle's Rest without hesitation or wasted motion. I think he rode into unknown territory without showing fear. I think he might be useful. Useful, Varela tasted the word. Yes, useful men are valuable. Loyal men are invaluable. The question is which one you are, Senor Cade. Give me a chance to prove it, Ethan said. Oh, I will. In fact, I have the perfect test. Varela gestured toward one of the cabins. We have a small problem that needs solving. One of my men, a fellow named Charlie Briggs, has been stealing from the communal supplies. Food, ammunition, whiskey, Not much, but enough that others have noticed. This creates resentment, undermines discipline. I need someone impartial to handle it. Ethan felt ice form in his stomach. Handle it how? However you see fit. You can beat him, you can banish him, you can kill him. The choice is yours, but you will handle it, and you will do it now, in front of everyone, so they all understand that theft is not tolerated in my organization. It was a trap dressed as a test. If Ethan refused, he'd be showing weakness or moral squeamishness that would mark him as unreliable. If he was too brutal, he'd reveal a sadistic nature that might make Varela wary of keeping him around. If he was too lenient, he'd fail to enforce discipline. There was no clean way through this. Bring him out, Ethan said. Two men dragged a third from one of the cabins. Charlie Briggs looked to be in his 30s, thin and worn, with the desperate eyes of someone who knew he'd made a fatal mistake. His hands were bound behind his back, and blood ran from his nose where someone had already hit him. Charlie, Varela said almost gently, this is Ethan Cade. He's going to decide what happens to you. If you have anything to say in your defense, say it now. Briggs's voice came out hoarse, trembling. I got a wife and 2 children down in Silver Creek. I've been sending them money when I can, but it ain't enough. They're starving. I just took a little extra to sell so I could send them more. I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry. The plea hung in the air, and Ethan felt every eye on him, watching to see what he'd do. He thought about the old prospector on the train, about Sarah Brennan, about all the victims Varela had left in his wake. This man Briggs was small-time, pathetic even, but he'd chosen to ride with Varela, chosen to profit from the gang's violence. Ethan stepped forward and looked Briggs in the eye. You made your choice when you joined this outfit. You knew the rules. You broke them. He pulled his Colt and pressed it to Briggs's forehead. The man's eyes went wide with terror, and a dark stain spread across the front of his pants. Please, Briggs whispered. Please, I got children. Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger, the metal cold and familiar. Then he lowered the gun and holstered it. But I'm not going to kill you for it, Ethan said, because killing you means your wife and children lose whatever support you were providing, and they're not the ones who stole. You are. He turned to Varela. With your permission, I'd suggest a different punishment. Give him a horse and supplies for 3 days. Send him out of this valley and tell him if he ever comes back, if he ever speaks of this place or these men, his family dies first and he dies second, slow and painful. Let him live with the knowledge that his greed cost him everything, his place here, his income, his reputation. Sometimes living with failure is a harder punishment than dying for it. The valley had gone completely silent. Varela stared at Ethan with an expression impossible to read, and for a long moment no one moved or spoke. Then Varela began to clap, slow and deliberate. Brilliant, he said. Absolutely brilliant. You show mercy without weakness, establish consequences without waste, and send a message that reaches beyond this valley. This is exactly the kind of thinking I value. He gestured to his men. Give Briggs what the new man suggests. 3 days of supplies and a horse that's not worth stealing. And Charlie, if I ever see your face again, remember what Senor Cade promised about your family. I'll make it come true. They dragged Briggs away, still sobbing with relief and shame. Varela turned back to Ethan, his scarred face split in a genuine smile. Welcome to the organization, Senor Cade. I think you and I are going to do great things together. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. That night, Ethan sat with Varela's men around a fire pit in the center of the valley, eating stew from tin plates and listening to the kind of talk that happened when violent men felt safe enough to relax. The conversation ranged from women to whiskey to past jobs, each story trying to outdo the last in terms of audacity or brutality. Ethan contributed little, which seemed to earn him more respect than if he'd boasted. Men who'd done real violence rarely felt the need to advertise it. Manuel Cortez sat across from him, cleaning his rifle with methodical care. You surprised me today, he said, without looking up from his work. Most new men would have killed Briggs just to prove they could. You found a third option. Killing him would have been easier, Ethan admitted. But waste bothers me. A dead man is just meat. A broken man is a message that walks and talks and spreads fear wherever he goes. Philosophical and practical. No wonder the Jefe likes you. Cortez ran an oiled cloth along the barrel of his Winchester. Tell me something, Cade. That story you gave about being tired of poverty, how much of it was true? The question was casual, but Ethan heard the weight beneath it. Cortez was smart, observant, and his loyalty to Varela meant he'd be watching for any sign of deception. Enough of it, Ethan said. I've taken jobs on both sides of the law. Some paid well, some didn't. The ones that paid worst were usually the legal ones, towns wanting someone to handle problems they were too civilized to solve themselves, then acting horrified when the solutions got messy. At least here, nobody pretends the work is anything other than what it is. Honest thievery instead of legal theft. Cortez smiled. Yes, that's the Jefe's philosophy exactly. He says the real criminals wear suits and hide behind banks and railroad companies. We're just taking back what was stolen from common people. Ethan had heard similar justifications from outlaws before. They all needed to believe they were something other than predators, Robin Hood instead of wolves. The irony was that Varela probably believed his own mythology, which made him more dangerous than simple greed ever could. So what's this big job everyone keeps hinting at? Ethan asked. Patience. The Jefe will explain when he's ready. For now, just know it's ambitious, bigger than anything we've attempted before. Higher risk, but potentially the kind of score that lets a man retire comfortably. One of the other men, a scarred American named Jack Morrison, who Hale's notes had identified as the explosives expert, leaned forward with interest. You ever work with dynamite, Cade? Some. Mostly for clearing rock falls or breaking up ice jams. Nothing fancy. Fancy's my specialty, Morrison grinned, revealing teeth stained brown from chewing tobacco. I can blow a safe so clean the money inside doesn't even get singed, or I can bring down a building and make it look like an accident. All depends on what the job requires. Copperfield's going to require your best work, Cortez said quietly. Morrison's grin widened. I've been preparing for weeks. Got enough dynamite cache near town to blow that bank vault clean open and still have enough left over to create a distraction that'll keep the law busy while we ride out. Ethan filed this information away carefully, making mental notes while keeping his expression neutral. So Hale had been right. Copperfield was the target. The bank vault would require explosives, which meant Morrison's involvement was critical. And they'd been planning this for weeks, maybe longer. How many men are going on this job? Ethan asked. That's up to the Jefe, Cortez said, but probably 12 to 15. Enough to handle trouble, not so many that we draw attention riding in. We'll hit them during the weekly payroll delivery. That's when the vault is fullest. When's that? Cortez studied him for a long moment, and Ethan realized he'd pushed too far, too fast. Asking questions was natural for a new recruit, but asking the wrong questions could trigger suspicion. Eager, aren't you? Cortez said softly. Just trying to understand the timeline. If I'm going to be part of this, I'd like to know how much time I have to prepare. Fair enough. Cortez set his rifle aside, seemingly satisfied with the cleaning. Payroll arrives every third Friday of the month. Next one is in 6 days. So you've got 6 days to prove you belong here, to learn how we operate, to become someone the Jefe trusts enough to bring on the biggest job we've ever pulled. 6 days. Ethan felt the weight of that deadline settling over him. He needed to get word to Hale somehow, needed to coordinate their response, but he was surrounded by armed men in a hidden valley with no clear way to communicate with the outside world. Any attempt to sneak away would be noticed and questioned. The fire burned lower as the night deepened, and men gradually drifted away to their bunks. Ethan was assigned a spot in one of the communal cabins, a rough structure with 8 beds and the smell of unwashed bodies and gun oil. He claimed a bunk near the door, positioning himself where he could see anyone coming or going. Sleep came in fragments, his mind too active to fully rest. He reviewed everything he'd learned, every detail that might be useful when the time came to act. The valley's geography, the number of men, their weapons and capabilities, the dynamics between different members of the gang. Cortez was clearly Varela's right hand, the planner and organizer. Morrison handled technical aspects. The Santos brothers, twin enforcers he'd seen but not yet spoken to, provided muscle and intimidation. And Varela himself sat at the center of it all, charismatic and ruthless, holding his small army together through a combination of fear, profit, and ideology. Ethan finally drifted into uneasy sleep just before dawn, only to be awakened 2 hours later by Cortez shaking his shoulder. "Up, Cade? The Jefe wants to see you." Ethan followed him across the valley to Varella's cabin, noting how the outlaw leader had positioned his quarters with tactical precision, against the valley wall so nothing could approach from behind, elevated enough to provide clear sight lines, close enough to the main camp to respond quickly to threats, but far enough for privacy. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly well appointed. A large desk dominated one corner, covered with maps and papers. Shelves held books, actual books, not the cheap dime novels most outlaws favored. A chess set sat on a side table, mid-game, suggesting Varela played against himself when no worthy opponent was available. The outlaw leader stood at the window, watching the valley wake up. He turned as Ethan entered, that permanent sardonic smile pulling at his scarred face. "Sit," Varela said, gesturing to a chair. "We need to talk about your role in what's coming." Ethan sat, keeping his posture relaxed but alert. Cortez remained standing near the door, positioned where he could respond to any threat. "Manuel tells me you asked about timeline and numbers," Varela said. "Good questions for a professional, but they also suggest you're thinking ahead, planning, which makes me curious about what else you might be planning." The accusation hung unspoken but clear. Ethan met Varela's gaze without flinching. "I'm planning to not get killed during whatever job you're organizing," Ethan said bluntly. "I've seen too many operations fail because someone didn't think things through, didn't prepare for contingencies. If I'm riding into danger, I want to know the shape of it. And if I told you the job is none of your business until I decide it is, then I'd say you don't trust me, which is fair since we just met. But trust works both ways. You want me to ride into a situation blind, following orders I don't understand, from a man I barely know. That takes faith. I'm not a faithful man. I'm a practical one. So either bring me into the planning or don't, but don't expect me to pretend I'm not thinking about survival." Varela laughed, genuine amusement lighting his dark eyes. "You have balls, I'll give you that. Most men would grovel, try to prove their loyalty with empty words. You just lay out the reality and dare me to deal with it." He walked to his desk and unfolded one of the maps, spreading it flat. "Come here. Look at this." Ethan rose and joined him at the desk. The map showed Copperfield and the surrounding territory in careful detail: roads, buildings, topography. Someone had marked various points with notations in Spanish and English. "Copperfield," Varela said, tapping the town center. "Population maybe 400, most of them miners and their families. The bank sits here, on Main Street, brick construction, reinforced vault. Every third Friday, they receive payroll delivery for the 3 biggest mining operations in the region. Total value usually runs between $18,000 and $22,000, mix of gold coin and currency." Ethan studied the map, his eyes tracking the streets and approaches. "Security? 4 armed guards inside the bank during payroll week. Another 6 hired guns that the mining companies bring in, usually ex-soldiers or territorial rangers, plus the town marshal and his deputy, though they're not much of a threat. Local boys more accustomed to breaking up drunk fights than facing professional outlaws. So potentially 12 armed men defending a stationary position, plus whatever civilians might grab weapons and get involved." "Exactly. Which is why we're not going to fight them head-on." Varela's finger traced a route on the map. "We're going to use misdirection. On the morning of the robbery, Morrison here will set off an explosion at the northern mine. Make it look like an accident, maybe a boiler malfunction. That'll draw most of the hired security away from town, along with the marshal and probably half the able-bodied men in Copperfield. While they're dealing with the crisis, we hit the bank," Ethan said, seeing the plan unfold. "Precisely. Small team, fast execution. Morrison blows the vault, we load the money, we're gone before anyone realizes what's happened. By the time they figure out the mine explosion was a diversion, we'll be miles away, scattered into the mountains where no posse can follow effectively." It was a good plan, Ethan had to admit. Ruthless and clever, taking advantage of human nature. The instinct to respond to immediate crisis over potential threat. The kind of plan that could work if executed properly. "What's my role?" Ethan asked. "You'll be part of the bank team. 6 men total. Myself, Manuel, Morrison, the Santos brothers, and you. Our job is to get in, secure the building, blow the vault, load the money, and get out. Speed and precision. No unnecessary killing unless someone forces the issue. And the others? Positioned around town as lookouts and backup. If something goes wrong, they provide covering fire for our withdrawal. If everything goes smooth, they never draw their weapons. Varela rolled up the map and fixed Ethan with that penetrating stare. Here's what I need to know, Cade. Can I count on you when bullets start flying? Because theoretical courage is easy. Real courage, the kind that holds steady when men are dying around you, that's rare. I've seen brave men turn coward the moment blood starts flowing. I've seen cowards find unexpected steel when their lives depend on it. Which one are you? It was a fair question, and Ethan knew his answer would be scrutinized for any hint of deception or uncertainty. I'm the kind who does what needs doing, Ethan said. I don't look for fights, but I don't run from them either. You put me in position, give me clear instructions, and I'll execute. But I won't die stupidly because someone else made a mistake. If things go wrong, I'll adapt and survive. That's who I am. Honest again, or at least convincingly honest. Varela walked to a cabinet and pulled out a bottle of tequila and 2 glasses. He poured generous measures and handed one to Ethan. To successful partnerships and profitable ventures. They drank, the liquor burning a path down Ethan's throat. It was good tequila, expensive, the kind that confirmed Varela had been successful at his trade for a while now. 6 days, Varela said, settling into his chair. You'll spend that time working with my men, learning how we operate, proving you can follow orders and think on your feet. Morrison will teach you the basics of handling explosives, not because you'll be setting charges, but because you need to understand the timing and risks involved. The Santos brothers will evaluate your combat skills. Manuel will assess your strategic thinking, and I'll be watching everything, looking for any sign that you're not what you claim to be. And if I pass all these tests, then you ride with us to Copperfield, help execute the biggest robbery this territory has seen in years, and walk away rich enough to disappear anywhere you want. Mexico, California, Canada. The world opens up when you've got real money. And if I fail, Varela's smile turned cold, then you'll have a tragic accident in these mountains, and we'll forget you ever existed. Those are the stakes, Cade. Success or death. There's no middle ground in this life. Ethan nodded, accepting the terms. Understood. Good. Now get out of here. Manuel will give you your assignments for the day. Ethan left the cabin and found Cortez waiting outside, leaning against the wall and smoking a thin cigar. Well, Cortez asked, you still alive and employed? Both. Then you passed the first test. The Jefe doesn't waste time on men he plans to kill. He just shoots them and moves on. The fact that he laid out the plan means he's considering you seriously. Cortez pushed off the wall and started walking toward the main camp. Come on, time to see if you're as good as you claim. The next several days blurred into a demanding routine of training, testing, and careful performance. Morrison took Ethan to a remote corner of the valley and demonstrated the art of explosive placement, how to calculate charges based on material density, how to use shaped charges to direct force, how to time multiple explosions for maximum effect. Bank vaults are tricky, Morrison explained, his hands moving with the practiced ease of an expert. Too much explosive and you damage the contents, maybe even destroy the currency. Too little and you just scar the door and alert everyone to what you're doing. The sweet spot is right here. He tapped a diagram he'd drawn in the dirt, where the hinges meet the frame. Blow both hinges simultaneously and the door falls right off. Clean, quick, effective. Ethan absorbed the information, filing it away not for criminal use but for eventual tactical advantage. Understanding how Morrison planned to crack the vault might provide opportunities to disrupt the robbery when the moment came. The Santos brothers, Carlos and Miguel, proved to be exactly what Hale's notes had suggested: brutal, efficient, and utterly loyal to Varela. They tested Ethan's combat skills through a series of sparring matches that started friendly and gradually escalated into something more serious. Carlos fought with knives, Miguel with his fists, and both moved with the dangerous grace of men who'd survived countless violent encounters. Ethan held his own, using techniques learned from a lifetime of hard experience. He wasn't trying to dominate them, that would breed resentment, but he couldn't afford to look weak either. By the end of the third day, They'd reached a grudging mutual respect, the kind warriors developed for worthy opponents. "You've got good instincts," Carlos said after a particularly intense knife-fighting session that had left both men bleeding from shallow cuts. "Most gringos fight like they're in a boxing ring, all rules and honor. You fight like someone who knows the only rule is survival." "Survival's kept me alive longer than honor ever did," Ethan replied, wrapping a bandana around a cut on his forearm. Miguel laughed and clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to bruise. "I like you, Cade. You don't talk shit, you don't make excuses, you just do the work. That's rare in this business." Cortez proved the most challenging evaluator, not through physical tests, but through increasingly complex scenario planning. He'd present hypothetical situations, ambushes, betrayals, equipment failures, and ask Ethan how he'd respond. The questions were designed to reveal thinking patterns, decision-making processes, moral boundaries. "You're riding with 3 other men," Cortez said one evening as they sat reviewing maps. "A posse catches up to you. You can outrun them if you abandon your wounded comrade, but staying means risking capture. What do you do?" Ethan considered the question carefully, knowing there was no single right answer, but that his response would reveal character. "Depends on the comrade," he said finally. "If it's someone I trust, someone who's proven loyal, I try to create a defensive position and hold them off long enough for him to escape or recover. If it's someone I barely know, someone who might betray me the moment it's convenient, I'd make the practical choice and ride. Loyalty has to be earned, not assumed." Cortez nodded thoughtfully. "Ruthlessly practical, but not without principle. That's the balance the Jefe values most." On the 5th day, Ethan finally found an opportunity to signal hail. He'd volunteered for guard duty on the valley's eastern ridge, a position that rotated among the gang members and provided elevated views of the surrounding mountains. The assignment meant hours of solitude, watching for approaching threats through a battered telescope. It also meant temporary freedom from constant observation. Ethan waited until midday, when the sun was high and shadows were minimal. He built a small fire using green pine branches that produced thick white smoke, then used a blanket to break the smoke column into 3 distinct puffs. The signal he and Hale had agreed upon for mission progressing, stand by. He maintained the signal pattern for several minutes, hoping Hale was somewhere out there with his own telescope, watching for exactly this communication. Then he scattered the fire and resumed his guard duties, scanning the mountains as if nothing had happened. That night, lying in his bunk while other gang members snored around him, Ethan reviewed everything he'd learned. The plan was solid, well-conceived, with contingencies for likely complications. Varela wasn't just a violent criminal, he was a tactical thinker who understood how to maximize advantage and minimize risk, which meant stopping him would require more than simple confrontation. It would require turning his own plan against him, finding the weakness in the strategy and exploiting it at exactly the right moment. The next morning, the 6th day, Varela called a general assembly in the valley center. All 23 members of the gang gathered around him, a small army of hard men who'd chosen violence as profession and profit as motivation. "Tomorrow," Varela announced, his voice carrying across the valley, "we execute the operation we've been preparing for. Copperfield will learn that banks are not as secure as they imagine, that wealth accumulated through exploitation of working men can be liberated and redistributed to those willing to take it." The men cheered, though Ethan noticed the enthusiasm was mixed with tension. Everyone understood tomorrow would be dangerous, that some of them might not survive to spend their shares of the robbery proceeds. Varela raised his hand for silence. "You all know your assignments. You all know the timing. We ride out in 3 groups at different times, approaching Copperfield from different directions to avoid attention. We assemble at the staging point at dawn. Morrison creates our diversion at precisely 8 o'clock. We hit the bank at 8:15. We're loaded and riding by 8:30. Fast, clean, professional." He paused, his scarred face serious. "But I want to be clear about something. This is not a massacre. We take the money, not lives. If someone forces our hand, we respond appropriately. But we don't kill unnecessarily. That's not who we are. We're not animals. We're soldiers in a war against corrupt systems. We're better than the men we're robbing. Remember that." It was a pretty speech, the kind that let violent men feel righteous about their violence. Ethan had heard similar rhetoric before, from officers sending soldiers into battles they'd never fight themselves, from politicians justifying policies that hurt the people they claimed to protect. The words changed, but the fundamental dishonesty remained constant. After the assembly, Cortez pulled Ethan aside. "You'll ride in the second group with me, Morrison, and 4 others. We leave at midnight, take the eastern route, arrive at the staging point around 5 in the morning. Get your gear ready, check your weapons, get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Ethan nodded and returned to his bunk to prepare. He cleaned his Colt until it gleamed, loaded his rifle, packed ammunition and supplies into his saddlebags. Everything had to appear normal, routine, the preparations of a professional readying for a job. But underneath the surface activity, his mind was racing through scenarios and possibilities. He needed to stop the robbery without blowing his cover too early, needed to coordinate somehow with Hale, needed to take down Varela and his key lieutenants while minimizing casualties among the gang members who were following orders rather than making strategic decisions. It was a complex problem with no clean solution, the kind that usually ended in blood and chaos, regardless of how carefully you planned. As darkness fell over Paradise Valley, Ethan lay in his bunk and stared at the rough wooden ceiling, thinking about the crucifix in his pocket. Sarah Brennan's final gift to a stranger, a request for justice from beyond the grave. He thought about Hale's pocket watch and the family stolen by violence. He thought about all the victims whose names he didn't know, but whose suffering was just as real. Tomorrow, one way or another, this hunt would reach its conclusion. The only question was who would be standing when the smoke cleared and the dead were counted. Midnight came cold and silent, the kind of mountain darkness that swallowed sound and made men speak in whispers even when there was no need. Ethan saddled his buckskin alongside Cortez and the others, checking cinches and stirrups with hands that had performed these motions 1,000 times. Around them, Paradise Valley lay still, most of the gang sleeping before their own pre-dawn departures. Morrison worked nearby, loading his saddlebags with carefully wrapped bundles of dynamite and blasting caps. The explosives expert handled the volatile materials with casual confidence that suggested either expertise or insanity, possibly both. "You ever see a bank vault after it's been properly cracked?" Morrison asked, noticing Ethan's attention. "It's beautiful in its own way. All that steel and iron, built to be impenetrable, reduced to scrap metal and opportunity, like watching nature overcome civilization." "Poetic," Ethan said neutrally. "I'm a poet of destruction." Morrison grinned in the darkness. "Most men build things. I unmake them. There's artistry in both." Cortez swung into his saddle and gestured for the others to mount up. "Enough philosophy. We've got a long ride and precise timing to maintain." They left Paradise Valley single file, following a trail that wound through pine forest so thick the stars disappeared overhead. Ethan rode third in line, behind Cortez and Morrison, with 3 other gang members bringing up the rear. The horses moved quietly over pine needles and soft earth, their breathing and the creak of leather the only sounds breaking the night silence. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Ethan's mind worked through scenarios and contingencies. Somewhere out there, Hale was watching, waiting, planning his own intervention. But without direct communication, they'd be operating blind, potentially working against each other instead of in coordination. The smoke signal had confirmed Ethan's infiltration success, but it hadn't conveyed details about timing, target confirmation, or tactical approach. They'd have to improvise, read each other's moves, hope that experience and professional instinct would bridge the communication gap. The eastern route took them through country that grew progressively more rugged as they descended from the high peaks toward the mining territory below. They passed abandoned prospect holes and played out claims, the skeletal remains of dreams that had died in these mountains. Dawn found them in a narrow canyon where a creek ran cold and fast over smooth stones. "We rest here for an hour," Cortez said, dismounting. "Let the horses drink and graze. Eat something if you can. Once we reach the staging point, there's no stopping until the job's done." Ethan led his buckskin to the creek and let it drink while he splashed cold water on his face, chasing away the fog of a sleepless night. The other men scattered along the creek bank, some eating jerky and hardtack, others checking weapons with the methodical care of professionals. Morrison sat apart from the group, carefully examining his explosives by the growing light. Ethan wandered over and sat on a nearby boulder, close enough to observe but not so close as to seem intrusive. Nervous? Morrison asked without looking up. Alert. Same thing, different words. The explosives expert held a stick of dynamite up to the light, examining it for any sign of sweating or degradation. First big job is always the hardest. After that, it's just another day's work. How many banks have you cracked? 14, if you count the ones I did solo before joining up with Varela. Never been caught, never had a charge fail to detonate when I needed it to. That's not luck. That's knowledge and respect for the craft. Morrison carefully rewrapped the dynamite and secured it in his bag. You know what kills the most robbers? Greed and stupidity, usually in combination. They get inside, see all that money, and lose their heads. Start grabbing everything, taking too long, ignoring the escape plan. That's when lawmen arrive and turn robbery into massacre. Varela seems disciplined enough to avoid that. He is. That's why I work for him instead of some penny ante outfit. The Jefe understands that the money's worthless if you're dead or imprisoned. Fast in, fast out, disappear before resistance can organize. It's a simple formula, but most outlaws can't follow it. Cortez called out that their rest period was ending, and the group remounted. They continued east as the sun climbed higher, turning the mountain peaks golden and casting long shadows across the valleys below. Around mid-morning, they emerged from the wilderness into settled territory, distant farms, occasional ranch houses, roads that showed regular use. The staging point turned out to be an abandoned mining camp about 5 miles from Copperfield, hidden in a fold of hills where old tailings piles and collapsed structures provided both cover and concealment. When they arrived, the first group was already there. 6 men, including the Santos brothers, all looking rested and ready despite their earlier departure. Varela stood near the entrance to a derelict shaft house, studying a pocket watch with the focused attention of a man for whom timing was critical. He looked up as Cortez's group arrived and nodded approval. Good. Everyone's on schedule. The third group should arrive within the hour, which gives us time to review assignments one final time. He gestured everyone to gather around a flat area where he'd spread out the map of Copperfield. Current time is 9:30. Morrison, you'll leave here at 7:45, take the northern trail to the mine. The explosion happens at exactly 8 o'clock. Questions? Morrison shook his head. I've got it timed to the minute. The boiler house has enough volatile material that the initial blast will look completely legitimate, just an unfortunate accident. By the time anyone realizes otherwise, we'll be long gone. Carlos, Miguel, you're on crowd control once we're inside the bank. Anyone who resists gets subdued but not killed unless absolutely necessary. Understood? The twins nodded in unison, their scarred faces expressionless. Manuel, you're my second inside the bank. If something happens to me, you take command and execute the withdrawal. Cade, Varela's dark eyes fixed on Ethan. You're on vault duty with Morrison once he joins us after setting the mine explosion. Your job is to help load the money into saddlebags and make sure nothing gets left behind in the confusion. What about the bank employees? Ethan asked. They get tied up and left in the manager's office. We're not butchers. We take money, not lives. Varela rolled up the map. The rest of you know your positions. Perimeter security, escape route protection, backup response if needed. Remember, speed and precision. We're in and out in 15 minutes maximum. The third group arrived shortly after, completing the assembly. 23 armed men, well-equipped and well-prepared, ready to execute a robbery that would either make them all rich or get them all killed. The tension was palpable as the morning progressed toward the moment of action. Ethan used the waiting time to position himself near the camp's western edge, ostensibly to keep watch, but actually to scan the surrounding hills for any sign of hail. The old colonel had to be out there somewhere, observing, planning his own intervention. But the landscape revealed nothing, just rock and sage and distance. At 7:45, Morrison departed for the mine, his saddlebags heavy with explosives and timing devices. Varela gathered the remaining men for final instructions. When we hear the explosion, we count to 5, then we ride. That gives emergency responders time to start reacting, which means they'll be moving away from town just as we're moving toward it. The timing is critical. Too early, and we lose the distraction effect. Too late, and they might realize it's a diversion. The minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness. Men checked weapons again, tightened cinches, made water, performed all the small rituals that preceded violent action. Ethan found himself touching Sarah Brennan's crucifix in his pocket, a talisman of purpose in the midst of gathering chaos. At precisely 8 o'clock, a distant rumble rolled across the hills, followed seconds later by a column of black smoke rising into the morning sky from the direction of the northern mine. The explosion had been substantial. Morrison had done his work well. "Now," Varela said calmly, and swung into his saddle. They rode toward Copperfield at a measured pace, not rushing, not drawing attention. Just a group of men heading toward town on business, nothing remarkable to casual observers. As they approached the outskirts, Ethan could see chaos spreading through the settlement, men running toward horses, women shouting questions, the general pandemonium of a community responding to crisis. The bank stood on Main Street exactly as Varela's map had shown, a 2-story brick building with barred windows and a heavy oak door. Under normal circumstances, it would have been well defended, but these weren't normal circumstances. Most of the hired security had already ridden north toward the mine explosion, along with the marshal and a significant portion of the town's able-bodied men. Varela's gang split into predetermined groups. 6 men took up positions around the town's perimeter, ready to provide covering fire or block pursuit. The core team, Varela, Cortez, the Santos brothers, Ethan, and 2 others, dismounted in front of the bank and moved quickly toward the entrance. Inside, 3 remaining guards reacted with admirable speed, reaching for their weapons even as they recognized the threat. But they were outmanned and outgunned, and Varela's voice cut through the moment with commanding authority. "Drop your weapons or die right now. Your choice." The guards hesitated, calculating odds and finding them insurmountable. One by one, they lowered their rifles. "Smart decision," Varela said. "Carlos, Miguel, secure them in the back office with the bank staff. No heroics from anyone, and everyone lives to tell their grandchildren about the day they were robbed by professionals." While the twins herded the guards and terrified bank employees toward the manager's office, Cortez moved to the front windows, positioning himself to watch the street for any response. Ethan and the others approached the vault, a massive steel door at the rear of the building, locked and supposedly impregnable. Varela checked his watch. "Morrison should be here in 3 minutes. Once he arrives, we give him 5 minutes to crack the vault, then 5 more to load everything. 13 minutes total from entry to exit." The precision of the timeline was impressive, almost military in its exactness. But precision also meant vulnerability to disruption. Any delay, any unexpected complication, and the whole operation could collapse into chaos. Morrison burst through the bank's front door exactly when expected, his face flushed from hard riding and his hands already reaching for his saddlebags. Explosion went perfect. Half the town headed north, just like we planned. "Then let's not waste their absence," Varela said. "Open it." Morrison moved to the vault with the confidence of long practice, examining the lock mechanism and the hinges with expert attention. He pulled out carefully measured charges of dynamite, shaped them with clay to direct the blast force, and positioned them with mathematical precision at both hinges. "Everyone back," he ordered, unreeling a length of fuse. "This is going to be loud." They retreated to the far side of the bank's main room, and Morrison lit the fuse. The cord burned with a hissing sparkle, counting down seconds toward explosion. Ethan crouched behind a heavy desk, covering his ears, watching the fuse disappear into the shaped charges. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, a thunderclap that shook the building and sent plaster dust raining from the ceiling. But when the smoke cleared, Morrison's expertise was evident. The vault door hung at an angle, its hinges destroyed, the steel barrier reduced to an obstacle that 3 men could lever out of the way. Inside the vault, money waited in neat stacks, gold coins in canvas bags, currency bundled and labeled, the accumulated wealth of 3 mining operations and their workers. Enough to make every man here rich by frontier standards, enough to justify the risk and planning. "Load it," Varela commanded, and his men moved with practiced efficiency, filling saddlebags with gold and currency, working quickly but not carelessly. Ethan worked alongside them, his hands moving automatically while his mind raced ahead to what came next. The robbery was proceeding exactly as planned, which meant the moment for disruption was approaching. But he needed to time his intervention precisely, needed to ensure Varela didn't escape in the confusion. "Movement outside," Cortez called from his window position. 3 men with rifles coming from the east probably heard the explosion. "How long until they reach us?" Varela asked, his voice calm despite the complication. 2 minutes, maybe less. Then we work faster. Fill every bag. Leave nothing behind. The loading continued with increased urgency, men shoving money into bags with less care for organization. Ethan glanced toward the windows, seeing the approaching men, townspeople, not professional gunfighters, but armed and probably angry enough to be dangerous. Then he saw something else, something that made his blood run cold. Across the street, on the roof of the general store, a figure moved into position with a rifle. Even at this distance, even through the bank's grimy windows, Ethan recognized the weathered features and pale blue eyes. Hale. The old colonel had positioned himself for a perfect shot at anyone exiting the bank. But his angle meant he couldn't see inside, couldn't distinguish between gang members and hostages, couldn't know that Ethan was among the robbers. If Hale opened fire when they emerged, he'd kill indiscriminately, and Ethan would likely be among the casualties. The trap Varela had planned for the bank was becoming a trap that enclosed them all. "Bags are loaded," Morrison announced. "We're ready to move." Varela checked his watch one final time. 12 minutes since entry, right on schedule. Everyone mount up and ride south according to plan. We scatter at the fork, rendezvous back at Paradise Valley in 3 days. If anyone gets separated, you know the fallback positions. They began moving toward the door, heavy saddlebags slung over shoulders, weapons ready. The townspeople approaching from the east had taken cover behind a wagon, their rifles visible but not yet firing. Hale remained motionless on the rooftop, waiting for clear targets. Ethan made his decision. As Varela reached for the door handle, Ethan stepped forward and pressed his Colt against the outlaw leader's spine. "Nobody moves," Ethan said quietly. "Everyone stays calm, and we might all survive this." The moment froze, every person in the bank suddenly aware that the situation had shifted from controlled robbery to something far more dangerous. Cortez's hand moved toward his weapon, but Ethan's voice stopped him. "Don't, Manuel. I can kill him before you clear leather, and then everyone dies in the crossfire. Is that what you want?" Varela stood perfectly still, his body tense, but his voice remarkably steady. "I should have trusted my instincts about you, Cade, or whatever your real name is. Doesn't matter what my name is. What matters is that you're surrounded. There's a rifleman on the roof across the street who will kill the first person through that door. There are armed townspeople behind the wagon to the east, and you've got maybe 2 minutes before the men who rode to the mine realize it was a diversion and come back here ready for war. So what do you want? The bounty? You can have my share of the money, buy yourself a nice retirement." So, "I don't want money. I want you to answer for what you've done. Sarah Brennan, the families in Silver Creek, all the people you've hurt while pretending to be some kind of revolutionary hero." Recognition flickered in Varela's eyes. "Ah, so this is about justice. How noble. Tell me, are you law or just another bounty hunter with a conscience? Does it matter?" "Not particularly. Either way, you're making a mistake. Kill me, and my men will tear you apart. Let me go, and I'll make sure you die slowly as an example to others who might betray me." The Santos brothers had moved to flank Ethan from both sides, their hands on their weapons but not yet drawing. Morrison stood near the vault, explosives still in his bag, his expression calculating. Cortez remained by the window, torn between loyalty to Varela and the practical reality that intervening would trigger a bloodbath. "There's a third option," Ethan said. "You surrender peacefully, stand trial, let the law decide your fate. Your men walk away. They were following orders, not making strategic decisions. No one else has to die today." Varela laughed, a sound without humor. "You really believe that? That these men would just abandon me? That the law would give me a fair trial instead of a rope? You're naive, Cade. The world doesn't work that way." "Maybe not, but it's the only offer you're getting." Outside, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The townspeople behind the wagon had been joined by others, and their voices carried through the broken windows, angry shouts demanding the robbers surrender or face consequences. On the rooftop, Hale shifted position slightly, and Ethan knew the old colonel's patience was running out. Then Morrison made his move. The explosives expert pulled a stick of dynamite from his bag and held it up, a lit match in his other hand. Here's a better offer. Everyone backs off, or I light this and we all die together. I've got enough dynamite here to bring this whole building down. It was a bluff, probably. Morrison was too professional to want to die in a pointless explosion, but the threat was real enough to freeze everyone again, creating a new layer of tension. Jack, don't be stupid, Cortez said from his position by the window. This doesn't have to end in fire. Doesn't have to end in surrender either. Morrison's hand trembled slightly as he held the match near the fuse. The Jefe's right. There's no fair trial waiting for us. Just a rope and a mob. I'd rather go out in flames than choking at the end of a noose. Ethan felt the situation spiraling beyond control, multiple competing interests and threats creating a powder keg that could explode at any moment. He needed to de-escalate quickly before fear and pride drove everyone toward mutual destruction. Jack, Ethan said carefully, you're a smart man, smarter than most here. You know that dying achieves nothing except making widows and orphans. Put down the dynamite, and I give you my word you'll walk out of here alive. Your word? Morrison laughed bitterly. You're the one who infiltrated us under false pretenses. Why would I trust anything you say? Because I could have killed Varela already, but didn't. Because I'm trying to end this without unnecessary death. Because despite everything, I recognize you're not evil, just men who made choices that led here. The match in Morrison's hand burned closer to his fingers, and Ethan could see the moment of decision approaching. Either the explosives expert would accept the offer or commit to mutual destruction. There was no middle ground. Then a new voice cut through the tension, powerful and commanding. Rico Varela. Everyone's attention snapped to the bank's front door, where a figure stood silhouetted against the morning light. Colonel Victor Hale had descended from his rooftop position and now stood in the doorway, his rifle held steady, his pale blue eyes fixed on Varela with the intensity of 7 years' accumulated hatred. Colonel, Varela said softly, still hunting me after all this time. I'm flattered. You murdered my family. Hale's voice was flat, emotionless, more terrifying in its control than rage would have been. My wife. My daughter. You took everything from me. I've killed a lot of people, Colonel. You'll have to be more specific about which ones you're avenging. The casual cruelty of the response broke something in Hale's expression. For just a moment, his professional control slipped, revealing the grief and fury that had driven him across territories and years. Santa Fe, 7 years ago. A school teacher and her 12-year-old daughter. Hale's finger tightened on the trigger. You remember now? Varela's expression shifted, some calculation happening behind his dark eyes. The standoff had reached its critical moment. 4 men with weapons drawn, each committed to incompatible outcomes, surrounded by others forced to choose sides in someone else's war. Outside, more townspeople were gathering, their voices rising in volume and anger. Time was running out for any resolution that didn't involve blood. Varela seemed to sense this too. His body relaxed slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried genuine curiosity rather than mockery. Tell me something, Colonel. If you kill me now, what changes? Does your wife come back? Does your daughter rise from her grave? Does the pain disappear? He paused. Or does it just leave you hollow? A man who's spent 7 years on revenge only to discover it tastes like ash? I'll find out soon enough, Hale said, and fired. The shot went high. Ethan had shoved Varela sideways at the last possible instant, sending both of them crashing to the floor as Hale's bullet punched through the space where the outlaw leader's head had been a heartbeat earlier. The round shattered a window behind them, and the sound of breaking glass mixed with shouts from outside and the crash of bodies hitting wood. Damn you, Cade! Hale's voice carried fury and betrayal as he worked his rifle's lever action, chambering another round. But the moment had broken the standoff's fragile equilibrium. The Santos brothers drew their weapons. Morrison dropped his dynamite and reached for his gun. Cortez spun from the window with his Colt clearing leather. What had been tense negotiation transformed instantly into the chaos Ethan had been trying to prevent. He rolled away from Varela and came up with his own weapon drawn, not targeting anyone specifically, but positioned to respond to whatever came next. His mind raced through terrible calculations. Who would fire first? who would die, how to stop this from becoming a massacre. Enough! The word came out like a thunderclap, carrying every ounce of authority Ethan possessed. Everyone stops right now, or I start shooting, and don't stop until my gun's empty. The command froze everyone mid-motion, weapons half raised, fingers on triggers, death hanging in the air like smoke. For 3 heartbeats, the tableau held. A dozen men balanced on the edge of violence, each waiting for someone else to make the choice that would doom them all. Varela broke the silence with laughter, genuine and unforced, as if he'd just witnessed something genuinely amusing. He pushed himself up from the floor, dusting off his clothes with casual movements despite the guns pointed in his direction. Well played, Cade. Or should I call you by your real name now? Doesn't matter, you've created an interesting problem. He looked around the bank, taking in the positions of his men, Hale's rifle, the growing crowd outside. We're all trapped here together, unable to move without triggering mutual destruction. A perfect stalemate. There's no stalemate, Hale said, his rifle now targeting Varela's chest instead of his head. You die here today. That's the only certainty. Is it? Varela walked slowly toward the old colonel, unconcerned about the weapon pointed at him. You could have killed me just now. Cade gave you a clean shot, and you took it. But you missed, or rather Cade made sure you missed. Why do you think he did that, Colonel? After infiltrating my organization, gaining my trust, positioning himself perfectly to end this? Hale's eyes flicked toward Ethan, questioning. Because I wanted you both alive, Ethan said. Wanted you to face consequences according to law, not revenge. Wanted to end this hunt without more blood than necessary. Noble sentiments. But nobility doesn't survive contact with reality. Varela was close to Hale now, close enough that the rifle barrel almost touched his chest. Go ahead, Colonel. Pull that trigger. Give yourself the revenge you've been chasing for 7 years. See if it fills the hole my actions carved in your life. It was a dare, a challenge, a psychological manipulation all wrapped together. Varela was testing Hale, trying to understand what kind of man he was dealing with, searching for weaknesses to exploit. Hale's finger tightened on the trigger, and Ethan saw the struggle playing out across the old man's weathered face. 7 years of pain and loss and single-minded pursuit had led to this moment. Everything he'd sacrificed, everyone he'd become, all the darkness he'd embraced in the name of justice. It all came down to this decision. The rifle lowered, just slightly. I'm not going to kill you, Hale said quietly. Not because you deserve mercy, but because my daughter deserved better than a father who became a murderer in her name. Varela's expression shifted, some calculation failing to produce the expected result. Disappointing. I thought you had more steel than that. I've got plenty of steel, but I've also got enough humanity left to recognize that killing you in cold blood would destroy the last piece of the man my wife loved. Hale stepped back, his rifle still ready but no longer actively threatening. You'll stand trial. You'll face public judgment, and whether you hang or spend the rest of your life in prison, you'll do it knowing that I was strong enough to choose law over vengeance. For a long moment, Varela simply stared at him, and Ethan saw something dangerous crystallizing behind those dark eyes. Then the outlaw leader moved with shocking speed, his hand darting toward the knife at his belt, even as he lunged at Hale. Ethan fired. The shot took Varela in the shoulder, spinning him away from Hale and sending the knife clattering across the floor. The outlaw leader stumbled against a desk, blood spreading across his white shirt, his face twisted with pain and rage. That's enough, Ethan said, his Colt steady on Varela. Next one goes through your heart. You want to die here? Keep testing me. You want to live? Get down on the floor and stay there. Varela's men had their weapons drawn now, creating a crossfire that would kill everyone if it erupted. But Cortez's voice cut through the tension with unexpected authority. Stand down, the second-in-command ordered. All of you, lower your weapons. This is over. Manuel? One of the Santos brothers looked confused, torn between loyalty and self-preservation. I said stand down. Look around you. We're outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of options. The Jefe's wounded, the law's gathering outside, and we've got maybe 5 minutes before this becomes a siege we can't win. Cortez holstered his own weapon with deliberate care. I didn't ride with Rico Varela for 3 years just to die stupidly in a bank robbery gone wrong. The logic was inescapable, and one by one, the other gang members lowered their weapons. Morrison set his gun on a desk and raised his hands. The Santos brothers looked at each other, some wordless communication passing between them, then holstered their pistols. Varela, still bleeding from his shoulder, laughed bitterly from his position against the desk. Betrayed by my own second-in-command. There's a certain poetry to it. Not betrayal, Jefe. Survival. You taught me to recognize when a fight's lost and adapt accordingly. Cortez looked at Ethan. So what now? You arrest us all? Turn us over to the mob outside? That depends, Ethan said. How many of you joined Varela's gang because you believed his revolutionary rhetoric, and how many just wanted easy money? The question hung in the air, forcing honest self-assessment. Morrison spoke first, his voice carrying a weary resignation. I believed it once. Thought we were fighting against corrupt systems, taking from the rich to give to ourselves because the world owed us compensation for being born poor. He gestured at the wounded Varela. But somewhere along the way I realized he didn't care about revolution or justice. He just liked the power, liked making people afraid. The rest was window dressing. Same, one of the other gang members said. Started noble, ended up just another outlaw robbing banks because that's what we did. The why stopped mattering. Varela's laughter had turned bitter. Listen to them. Rats abandoning a sinking ship, rewriting history to make themselves feel better. You rode with me because I made you rich and kept you alive. Everything else was just stories we told ourselves to sleep at night. Maybe, Cortez admitted. But here's the truth, Jefe. You crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. Sarah Brennan and women like her, that wasn't revolution, that was cruelty. The colonel's daughter, his voice hardened. That was evil, pure and simple. I followed you despite those things because I told myself the good we were doing outweighed the bad. I was wrong. Ethan could see the impact of Cortez's words on the other gang members. They'd needed permission to acknowledge what they'd known all along, that they'd been following a monster who'd convinced them they were heroes. The illusion was breaking, and men were having to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Outside, voices were growing louder, more organized. The townspeople were working up courage to storm the bank, and the gang members who'd remained on perimeter security would be facing difficult choices about whether to fight or flee. We need to resolve this before people outside start dying, Ethan said. Here's my offer. Anyone who surrenders peacefully and testifies against Varela will be given consideration for reduced sentences. You'll do time, but you'll live and eventually walk free. Anyone who fights will be treated as an active outlaw and dealt with accordingly. You have that authority? Morrison asked. I'm operating under Territorial Marshal's papers, which gives me broad discretion in field operations. But more than that, I'm offering you a chance to make a choice that defines who you are moving forward. Stay loyal to a man who used you, or save yourselves and maybe salvage something from this disaster. The Santos brothers conferred quietly in Spanish, their voices too low to hear clearly. Then Carlos stepped forward, his scarred face set with determination. We'll surrender, but we want guarantees about treatment. We're not animals. We won't be paraded through town for mob justice. You have my word, Ethan said. You'll be transported to the territorial capital for proper trial. No lynching, no vigilante justice. One by one, the other gang members agreed. Morrison, Cortez, the remaining outlaws, all choosing survival and reduced sentences over a last stand that would end in death. Only Varela remained defiant, clutching his wounded shoulder and glaring at everyone with undisguised contempt. Cowards, he spat. All of you. We could have fought our way out, scattered into the mountains, regrouped, and come back stronger. We could have died uselessly, Cortez corrected. There's a difference between courage and stupidity, Jefe. You taught me that too, even if you forgot it yourself. Hale had remained silent during these negotiations, his rifle lowered but his eyes never leaving Varela. Now he spoke, his voice carrying a weight that commanded attention. I need 5 minutes alone with him before you take him into custody. Ethan had been expecting this request, had promised it back in that first meeting at Eagle's Rest, but circumstances had changed and he wasn't sure giving Hale unsupervised time with Varela was wise anymore. Colonel, you promised me this, Cade. 5 minutes to make him understand what he took from me. I'm not asking to kill him. I'm asking for the chance to speak truth without interference. It was a reasonable request given everything Hale had sacrificed in this hunt, and Ethan knew that denying it would leave the old colonel with unfinished business that would haunt him forever. 5 minutes, Ethan agreed, but I'm staying in the room, and if it turns violent, I intervene. Those are my terms. Hale nodded acceptance, and Ethan gestured for the others to move to the far side of the bank, giving them space but maintaining oversight. Varela watched this arrangement with obvious interest, his pain-twisted expression calculating possibilities. Hale approached slowly, and when he stood before Varela, he pulled out his pocket watch, the one his wife had given him on their wedding day. He held it so the outlaw leader could see the inscription. "For Victor, who has my heart always," Hale read. She saved for 6 months to afford this. A school teacher's salary didn't go far, but she wanted me to have something that would remind me of her whenever I checked the time. Varela's expression remained neutral, unreadable. Her name was Catherine. She taught children to read and write, believed education could lift people out of poverty and ignorance. She was kind to everyone, students, neighbors, even the drunks who sometimes bothered her on the street. Never met a person she couldn't find something good in. And yet she married a soldier, Varela said, someone whose profession was killing. Interesting contradiction. She believed I fought for something worth defending. Believed the violence I did was in service of protecting the innocent from predators. Hale's voice remained steady, controlled. Our daughter Emily was 12 when you killed her. She wanted to be a teacher like her mother. She loved horses and books and had this laugh that could light up a room. She was beginning to understand the world, beginning to form opinions about justice and morality and what kind of person she wanted to become. I don't remember her specifically, Varela said, and Ethan heard the cruelty in the admission, not denying the crime, just refusing to acknowledge the victim's humanity. I know, that's what makes it worse. You destroyed my family and don't even remember doing it. You've hurt so many people that individual victims blur together into meaningless statistics. Hale put the watch back in his pocket. 7 years ago, I would have tortured you for days before killing you, would have made you beg for death and denied it just to hear you scream. That's who I became in the immediate aftermath, a man consumed by rage and grief who couldn't see past revenge. And now? Varela asked. Now I see you clearly for what you are. Not a revolutionary, not a freedom fighter, not even a particularly impressive outlaw. Just a damaged man who inflicts his damage on others and calls it philosophy. You're pathetic, Varela. And the worst part is you'll die in prison or on the gallows without ever understanding that truth. For the first time, Ethan saw something like genuine emotion cross Varela's face, not remorse or shame, but recognition that Hale's words had struck deeper than bullets ever could. The outlaw leader had built his identity around being significant, being someone whose actions mattered. To be called pathetic, to be reduced to just another criminal, was perhaps the worst punishment Hale could inflict. That's your revenge? Varela asked quietly. Words? Words are all you deserve. My daughter's memory deserves better than me becoming a murderer. My wife's love deserves better than me wasting the rest of my life on hatred. Hale turned away. You're nothing to me now, Varela. Just another case to be processed, another file to be closed. I'm done giving you power over my life. The 5 minutes had passed, and Ethan moved forward to take custody of Varela. But before he could, the outlaw leader's hand moved with desperate speed, pulling a concealed derringer from inside his boot. The small pistol swung toward Hale's back, and Ethan saw the intention crystallize. If Varela couldn't escape, couldn't win, he'd at least take the man who'd defied him. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Ethan's bullet took Varela in the chest, dead center, a killing shot driven by reflex and necessity. But Hale had spun at the same instant, his own rifle firing, and his round struck Varela in the throat. The outlaw leader dropped without a sound, the derringer falling from nerveless fingers, blood spreading across the wooden floor in a dark pool. The bank went silent, except for the sound of Varela's final breaths, wet, gurgling, desperate. He tried to speak, but the throat wound made words impossible. His dark eyes fixed on Hale, and Ethan couldn't tell if the expression was rage or resignation or some combination of both. It took almost a minute for Rico Varela to die, and he spent every second of it staring at the man he'd wronged, unable to apologize or justify or even curse, just silence and blood and the inexorable approach of darkness. When it was finally over, Hale lowered his rifle and stood looking down at the corpse. His expression was complicated. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just a kind of exhausted acknowledgement that something long and painful had finally ended. "Self-defense," Ethan said quietly. "He drew on you." Both of us responded appropriately. "I know." Hale's voice was hollow. "Doesn't change the fact that I wanted him dead and got my wish, even if it came differently than planned. But you didn't murder him. That matters." "Does it?" Hale looked at Ethan, his pale blue eyes ancient with weariness. "I spent 7 years hunting him, 7 years becoming someone my wife wouldn't recognize. And in the end, he died because he was stupid and desperate, not because I was strong or just or righteous. What does that make me? Alive? Human. Someone who'll carry scars but doesn't have to let them define everything else." Outside, the commotion was reaching critical mass. Ethan moved to the door and called out to the gathered townspeople. "The robbery's over. The outlaws are surrendering. Send for the territorial marshal and medical assistance. We've got wounded who need treatment and prisoners who need proper custody." The announcement seemed to deflate the crowd's building aggression. Men lowered weapons, women stopped shouting, children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts to see what had happened. The mayor, a rotund man with impressive mutton chops, pushed forward with the town marshal beside him. "The money?" the mayor asked. "Still in the vault, mostly. Some in saddlebags will return to proper custody." Ethan gestured toward Varela's body. "Rico Varela is dead. His gang is surrendering. The threat is over." The marshal, a young man barely past 20 who'd probably never expected to face real outlaws, stared at the scene with wide eyes. "Who are you? You're not territorial law." "I'm working under Marshal's authority on a bounty contract." Ethan pulled out his papers and showed them. "Everything here is legal and proper. I'll need you to help secure the prisoners until they can be transported to the capital for trial." The next several hours passed in a blur of activity. The bank's hostages were freed, shaken but unharmed. The money was counted and verified, every dollar accounted for and returned to the vault. Varela's gang members were placed under guard in the town jail, which had been built to hold maybe 3 drunks, and now contained 15 outlaws in various states of resignation and relief. Morrison, true to his word, provided detailed information about the gang's operations, their hideouts, their methods. Cortez did the same, his military background making his testimony particularly valuable. The Santos brothers remained mostly silent but cooperative, accepting their fate with stoic calm. The townspeople's anger gradually transformed into something more complex. Gratitude for the robbery's failure mixed with uncertainty about who to credit. Ethan deflected praise toward Hale, explaining the old colonel's role in tracking Varela across territories and years. It seemed fitting that the man who'd sacrificed so much should receive recognition, even if Hale himself seemed indifferent to it. By late afternoon, a telegraph had been sent to the territorial capital, and responses were coming back authorizing prisoner transport and confirming bounty payment. The marshal from Silver Creek arrived with additional deputies, having heard about the mine explosion and come to investigate. He took custody of the prisoners with obvious relief, probably grateful that someone else had handled the dangerous work. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Ethan found Hale sitting alone outside the general store, watching the activity in town with detached interest. The old colonel had cleaned his rifle and reloaded it with the automatic movements of long habit, but now it lay across his knees, forgotten. "It's done," Ethan said, settling onto the bench beside him. "Is it?" Hale stared at the distant mountains. "Varela's dead, his gang's captured, the money's recovered. By any objective measure, this is a successful conclusion. So why does it feel so empty?" "Because you spent 7 years building toward this moment, and now that it's arrived, you have to figure out what comes next. Revenge gave you purpose. Without it, you're just a man without a mission." Wise words from someone so young. "How old are you, Cade? 30? 35? 32. "I've got boots older than you." But there was no venom in the observation, just weary amusement. "What will you do now? Collect your bounty? Find the next hunt?" "Probably. It's what I know how to do." Hale nodded slowly. Be careful it doesn't consume you the way hunting Varela consumed me. There's always another criminal, another bounty, another reason to keep writing instead of settling somewhere and building a life. Before you know it, you're 60 years old and everyone you loved is dead or gone, and all you've got to show for it is a collection of wanted posters and memories of people you've killed. What about you? What's next for Colonel Victor Hale? The old man was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands resting on the rifle. I honestly don't know. Maybe I'll go back to Santa Fe, visit Catherine and Emily's graves, make peace with what happened. Maybe I'll disappear into the mountains and live out whatever time I have left in solitude. Maybe I'll find some other purpose worth pursuing. He looked at Ethan. The bounty money, you should take it all. You did the real work, infiltrating the gang, setting up the confrontation. I just needed to see it end. The bounty is $5,000. We agreed to split it 50-50. I don't need the money. I've got savings, military pension, enough to live comfortably. You're young, still building a life. Take it. Use it wisely. Maybe buy some land somewhere. Start over as someone other than a bounty hunter. Ethan started to protest, but something in Hale's expression stopped him. The old man needed this. Needed to give something meaningful. Needed to believe his 7 years of pursuit had resulted in more than just death and vengeance. All right, Ethan said, but on one condition. You take enough to make that trip to Santa Fe, visit those graves, say whatever you need to say. Don't just disappear into the wilderness because you're too tired to figure out what living means. Hale smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something almost gentle. Deal, though I suspect we're both giving each other advice we won't follow. Probably. They sat in comfortable silence as the town continued its recovery around them. Children were playing in the street again, merchants were reopening shops. Life was reasserting itself with the resilience that small communities developed as survival mechanisms. By tomorrow, the robbery would be a story people told. By next month, it would be legend. By next year, most people would remember only that something dramatic happened, the details blurred and exaggerated. That evening, the mayor insisted on hosting a dinner for everyone involved in stopping the robbery. It was held in the town's only restaurant, a modest establishment that normally served miners and their families but had been commandeered for the occasion. The food was simple but plentiful. The whiskey flowed freely, and speeches were made praising courage and quick thinking and the triumph of law over lawlessness. Ethan endured it with as much grace as he could manage, accepting thanks while deflecting credit, answering questions while revealing little. Hale sat beside him, drinking steadily but remaining sober through some alchemy of experience, his pale eyes watching the celebration with detached interest. They need this, Hale observed quietly. Need to believe order has been restored, that justice prevailed, that tomorrow will be safer than today. The truth is messier. Varela died because he was foolish enough to draw on armed men. His gang surrendered because they valued survival over loyalty, and the robbery failed partly through luck. But truth doesn't comfort people the way mythology does. Let them have their mythology then, Ethan said. We know what really happened. That's enough. 2 days later, a transport wagon arrived from the territorial capital to collect the prisoners. Cortez and Morrison and the others were loaded into the reinforced wagon under heavy guard, still wearing chains but treated with basic human dignity. The territorial marshal who'd come to oversee the transfer reviewed all the documentation with bureaucratic thoroughness, confirming identities, charges, evidence. Before the wagon departed, Cortez called out to Ethan from behind the bars. Cade, or whatever your real name is, I hope you find what you're looking for, and I hope it's worth the price you're paying for it. What price is that? The price of being alone. Of trusting no one completely because trust might get you killed. Of always being the hunter, never the hunted, never just a person living a normal life. Cortez smiled sadly. Maybe that's what I'm looking forward to about prison. For the first time in years, I'll just be a man, not an outlaw. There's a kind of freedom in that. The wagon rolled out of town, carrying 15 men toward trials and sentences and futures they couldn't control. Ethan watched it disappear down the road and wondered if Cortez was right. If the real prison was the one you built around yourself with choices and consequences and the inability to stop being what circumstances had made you. The bounty payment arrived via bank draft 3 days later. $5,000. A fortune, by any standard. Ethan stood in the bank where the robbery had occurred, holding the paper that represented more money than he'd ever possessed at one time, and felt absolutely nothing. No triumph, no relief, just a hollow recognition that one hunt had ended and another would begin soon. He found Hale preparing to leave town, his horse saddled and supplies packed for a journey south toward New Mexico territory and the graves that waited there. The old colonel looked different somehow, lighter, despite the weight of memory he still carried. "You're really going to Santa Fe?" Ethan asked. "I am. Going to stand at Catherine's grave and tell her I didn't become the monster I was afraid of becoming. Going to stand at Emily's grave and tell her I'm sorry, I couldn't save her, but I at least stopped the man who hurt her." Hale swung into his saddle with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime on horseback. "After that, who knows? Maybe I'll find something worth living for instead of dying for. Good luck, Colonel. You too, Cade. And remember, the hunt can wait. Life can't. Don't learn that lesson the way I did." Hale rode south, and Ethan stood watching until horse and rider became a distant speck against the landscape. Then he walked to his own horse, checked his gear, and considered his options. He could ride to the territorial capital and collect another assignment. He could head west toward California and new opportunities. He could go north into unsettled country where a man could disappear if he wanted to. Instead, he pulled out Sarah Brennan's crucifix, the one her father had given him on the train, with the request that Varela see it before dying. In the chaos of the bank confrontation, Ethan had forgotten to show it, forgotten the promise he'd made. He stood there holding the tarnished silver, feeling the weight of incomplete obligations and unfinished business. Then he mounted his buckskin and turned it toward Silver Creek, where an old prospector waited to learn whether his daughter's death had been avenged or simply added to the endless list of frontier tragedies that no one remembered. The ride took most of a day, following wagon roads through country that was slowly being civilized, homesteads appearing where wilderness had been, telegraph lines stringing together isolated communities, the slow but inexorable spread of settlement and law. Ethan rode through it all like a ghost from an earlier time, someone whose skills would soon be obsolete, whose profession would be replaced by proper courts and official marshals. Silver Creek turned out to be smaller than he'd expected, just a collection of buildings clustered around a creek that probably ran silver in certain light. He found the old prospector at a boarding house, not the one his daughter had run, but a smaller establishment where single men could rent rooms by the week. The old man looked even more diminished than Ethan remembered, as if grief had physically compressed him, but his eyes sharpened with recognition when Ethan entered the boarding house common room. "You," the prospector said, "from the train. You said you'd make Varela see this." He gestured to the crucifix Ethan still held. "I tried, but circumstances didn't allow it. Varela's dead, though. Shot trying to kill the man who'd been hunting him for 7 years. It was quick, quicker than he deserved, but final." The old man absorbed this information, his gnarled hands gripping the edge of the table where he sat. Did he suffer? Some. Not enough to balance what he'd done, but enough to know he was dying. "And my daughter, did you tell him about Sarah before he died?" Ethan could have lied, could have given the old man the closure he desperately wanted, but lies, even kind ones, had a way of festering. No, there wasn't time, and he wouldn't have cared anyway. Men like Varela don't feel remorse. They just regret getting caught. Ethan set the crucifix on the table. But his gang is destroyed, his operations are finished, and every person he hurt can sleep knowing he won't hurt anyone else. It's not perfect justice, but it's what the world allowed. The old man picked up the crucifix, his weathered fingers tracing the silver cross. "I wanted him to know her name. Wanted him to understand what he'd taken from the world. I know. But some debts can't be paid, some losses can't be balanced. All we can do is stop the bleeding and try to prevent it from happening again." They sat in silence for a while, two men bound by the violence that had touched their lives in different ways. Finally, the prospector spoke again. "What will you do now? Find another hunt?" "Probably. It's what I know." Sarah used to say that the saddest people were the ones who only knew one thing. Said it made them brittle, unable to bend when life demanded flexibility. The old man smiled at the memory. She was talking about me and my prospecting, but I think she'd say the same about you and your hunting. Ethan thought about Hale's similar warning, about Cortez's observation about the price of being always alone. Maybe they were all trying to tell him something he wasn't ready to hear yet. He left Silver Creek as the sun began setting, riding west toward a horizon that glowed with the last light of day. Behind him, the old prospector stood at the boarding house door, watching him go, still holding his daughter's crucifix. Ahead, the frontier stretched endlessly, full of opportunities and dangers, hunts waiting to be undertaken and bounties waiting to be collected. But for the first time in years, Ethan wondered if there might be something else worth pursuing. Some life that didn't revolve around violence and death and the endless chase. Some version of himself that could exist without a gun and a wanted poster and a trail that led nowhere except to the next hunt. The buckskin carried him through the twilight, steady and sure-footed, while Ethan's mind wrestled with questions he'd been avoiding for too long. The $5,000 in his saddlebag could buy land, could finance a legitimate business, could provide foundation for something more permanent than the transient existence he'd been living. He thought about Catherine Hale, the schoolteacher who'd believed education could lift people from poverty. He thought about Sarah Brennan, running a boarding house and trying to make a life in rough country. He thought about Emily, the 12-year-old girl who'd wanted to be a teacher like her mother but never got the chance. They'd all tried to build something meaningful in a world that too often rewarded violence over creation. And they'd all been destroyed by men who only knew how to take, never to give. Maybe the real victory over people like Varela wasn't just stopping them. Maybe it was refusing to become like them, refusing to let violence be the only answer to every problem, refusing to spend your entire life hunting monsters until you forgot how to be anything else. 3 weeks later, Ethan rode into a small town in Montana Territory that didn't have a name yet, just a collection of buildings around a crossroads where ranchers and farmers were trying to build community. The land was cheap, the people were desperate for anyone with capital and ambition, and the opportunities were genuine for someone willing to work. He bought a plot of land with a view of the mountains, started building a house with his own hands, and hung his gun on a peg where he could see it but didn't have to wear it. The first few weeks felt strange, almost wrong, as if he was betraying something fundamental about who he was. But gradually, the rhythm of different work began to feel natural. Cutting timber, laying foundation stones, planning for a future that extended beyond the next hunt. He hired local men to help with the construction, paid them fairly, learned their stories. There was a widow with 2 children who needed steady employment, so he hired her to cook for the work crew. There was a young man with skill at carpentry but no capital to start his own business, so Ethan partnered with him. Slowly, without quite meaning to, he started building the kind of community that people like Varela destroyed. A place where people looked out for each other, where children could grow up without fear, where futures were possible instead of just survival. He never forgot Rico Varela, or Sarah Brennan, or Emily Hale, or any of the others whose lives had intersected with his during that hunt. Their ghosts visited him sometimes, especially in the quiet hours before dawn when sleep was elusive. But they weren't demanding vengeance or justice anymore. They were just there, witnesses to the life he was choosing instead of the one that had chosen him. Somewhere in New Mexico Territory, Colonel Victor Hale stood at 2 graves and finally allowed himself to weep for what he'd lost. Somewhere in the territorial capital, Manuel Cortez and Jack Morrison and the others waited for trials that would determine their futures. Somewhere in Paradise Valley, an empty outlaw camp slowly returned to wilderness, reclaimed by the mountains that had hidden it. And on the frontier that was slowly becoming civilized, Ethan Cade built a house and planted crops, and learned that sometimes the bravest thing a warrior could do was choose peace. Not because violence wasn't effective, but because peace was harder, required more courage, demanded that you believe in something beyond the hunt. The mountains still called to him sometimes, whispering about trails that led to dangerous men and profitable bounties. But he'd learned to let those whispers fade unanswered, to find satisfaction in work that built instead of destroyed, in relationships that deepened instead of transactions that ended. Years later, when travelers passed through and asked about the quiet man who owned the ranch with the mountain view, locals would tell them he used to be something else. A hunter, maybe, or a lawman, or just a drifter who got tired of drifting. The stories varied depending on who was telling them, and Ethan never corrected the inaccuracies, because the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. He'd been a man who chose what came next instead of letting the past choose for him. Who'd learned that survival belonged to the smartest, but legend belonged to the bold, and wisdom belonged to those brave enough to walk away from both when something better presented itself. The frontier would always need hunters to chase down monsters, but it also needed builders to create the kind of world where monsters couldn't thrive. And in the end, Ethan decided he'd rather be remembered as someone who built something lasting than someone who just excelled at destruction. The sun set over his land, painting the mountains in shades of fire and gold. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Cade felt something that might have been contentment. Not happiness exactly, the ghosts wouldn't allow that, but a sense that the path he'd chosen led somewhere worth arriving at. And that was enough.